And if you have someone on your team who's struggling, what are your goals? What do you need? Maybe they're in the wrong role. How can you support them to thrive, whether it's at your organization or a different one?
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Conversation with Keita Demming. In this podcast, I'm going to have conversations with thought leaders and entrepreneurs around the world around how do we answer two questions. How do we become better people in business, and how do we become better business people? I decided to start with a conversation I had with the author of this book, Speak Up Culture. It's by Stephen Shedletzky, and in it, he really takes the idea of psychological safety much further and how that applies to the business world. If you want to learn more about the podcast, visit keitademming.com. If you want to support my work, check out my upcoming book, Strategy to Action, or join my mailing list if you'd like to learn more in-depth things around those two questions. How do we become better people in business, and how do we become better business people? I hope you enjoyed today's episode. So, Stephen, I thought how we would start this podcast is you have a line in your book where you say, this conversation is over, but it's not complete. That is probably my favorite line in that book. Tell me about that.
So it's a distinction in language I've learned as a facilitator over the years that sometimes conversations are finished, but not complete. So a finished conversation is one that is done typically because of time constraints. You have to run to the next meeting, go pick up your kids from soccer practice, whatever it might be, and yet more could be said to get to complete. A complete conversation is one in which you get the sense that you yourself have nothing further to say. You feel complete, and you get the sense that the other participant or participants in that conversation are complete as well. And you can even ask questions like, are we complete? What further? And I think one of the greatest tricks, if you want to become a better communicator, is to track what conversations are finished versus what conversations are complete. And if the conversation feels finished, design an opportunity to complete it, and then actually complete it. And your effectiveness as a communicator and leader, I think, will positively skyrocket.
Before we get into it, how about you just introduce yourself? So for folks who have no idea who you are and what you do, how about you just share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So I love being called Shed because my last name is complicated, and I like to identify as Shed. Feels like it matches my personality. Everything I do is to help people feel as though their voice is welcome. So much of what has informed my work has been through my own life experiences. So one, I grew up with a speech impediment and a stutter. And so I know what it feels like to be voiceless. I've since found a passion in helping people communicate their ideas and feelings in a way that others can connect with and understand. And I've also, in my 15 plus year career, Keita, have had experiences where I've been part of what I call a speak up culture, where it is both safe and worth it to share ideas, feedback, concerns, disagreements, mistakes. And it's marvelous. Not only is it fantastic for the relationships that we develop with the people on our team, people that we genuinely call friends, people that we love, it's also fantastic for business, creativity, innovation, retention, engagement, all of those positive results as well. Relationship is the foundation of accomplishment. I've also been parts of teams where there isn't a speak up culture, or maybe there was, but due to shifts in leaders and leader behaviors, it's no longer a speak up culture. And you might speak up, but you filter what you share. And oftentimes, if you bring up bad news or a concern, you're made to be the problem. And it's cultures ripe with toxic positivity and gaslighting. I've been parts of those cultures as well. And not only is it bad for business, it's bad for the health and well-being of people. So I have this book coming out, which you've had a sneak peek read of, called Speak Up Culture: When Leaders Truly Listen, People Step Up. And I've devoted my life's work and career to attempting to help create healthier, better organizations and cultures, which has everything to do with the behavior of leaders.
So I want to double click on your book and why you wrote that and why you feel like that book needs to be in the world right now. But before that, let's rewind a bit. one of my own biases and the thing I talk about in my book is let's make a distinction between organizations as machines and organizations as conversations. So I use that metaphor talking about how we should view organizations as conversations. If you change the organization, you change the conversation. And what I want to double click on is you said when the conversation is finished but not complete, design an opportunity to finish the conversation.
To complete the conversation.
Complete the conversation. Yes. Thank you. And for a lot of people, they may not understand what you mean by design A, an opportunity, and B, design a conversation. Tell us a little bit more about that.
I mean, we could use this conversation as a very example. So we have a time allotted in our calendar. You did this. Before we started recording, you said to me, what is your hard stop? And I told you the exact time I need to leave to get ready for another meeting. Right. Should we continue this conversation, and it is rich and robust, and we just know we've scratched the surface on a few areas that we know we want to speak more about, we could agree to say, hey, this was great. There's more that we can discuss. Let's schedule a part 2 of this conversation, and then we actually schedule it and do it. So that's a very micro example of this. A more general example could be you're having a one-on-one meeting with your direct report. You've got to run to something else, or they've got to run to something else. And you say, hey, I get the sense that this isn't a complete conversation. I get the sense that we could speak more on this. What do you think? Right? Hey, how about next Tuesday morning? Let's finish and let's go for a walk through that neighborhood and do it together, or hop on the phone or Zoom or whatever it might be. And so when you get the sense that more can be discussed to get to a feeling of complete, name it, identify it, offer it, and then actually schedule in a time to complete that conversation.
So, and the next question I'm about to ask you might be a little bit an unfair one, but do you have any tips around how to design that second conversation? So, okay, I can schedule it so we can design the opportunity, but how do I design the conversation, particularly when it's one that is high stakes or there's some tension involved in that conversation?
Beautiful question. I've actually never had this question before, but I have some ideas. I'd love to hear of your ideas as well. Yes. So I think one of the first things to do is, I'm a huge fan in any conversation. The first thing to offer or do is a check-in. Like, how are you entering into this conversation? What's going on? Maybe something's happening with your kids. Maybe you're delayed on a project. Like, how are you entering? What's the mood that we're entering, and what do we need to say to be present? Which could include, I'm expecting a package to be delivered in the next 2-hour time slot, and I want to grab it if it arrives. So I might get interrupted by that. I think first and foremost, it's healthy to do a check-in so we know how we're entering and we know how to make this the most productive, present conversation possible. So a check-in, and it doesn't need to be too long. The next thing I think is a meaningful recap. Hey, can we each share what we took from our last conversation or what we heard, and not do that from a perspective of this is fact, but this is opinion, and to open the other party or parties to add on, disagree, highlight points that are worth highlighting, so that we're on the same page as we enter into the conversation to complete on it. And then it's, all right, what else have we not discussed, or what else have we not said that we need to get to a feeling of complete on this topic of this tension, this feeling, this conflict, this project, whatever that conversation is.
Awesome. And I think, so is there something else you want to share there before I jump into my next question?
Not there, but I do want to comment on there's organization from the perspective of its machinery. There's organization from the perspective of its conversations. I view an organization not as bricks, mortar, or the cloud if it's a fully remote team. I view an organization as what I believe it to be, which is a living, breathing organism. It's what it is. It evolves, it changes, it requires maintenance, it requires optimization. So I view an organization as that, a living, breathing organism made up of living, breathing individuals who make it what it is.
Let me ask another question. Why is it important that we have that metaphor of organizations as living, breathing organizations? Why is that for you? Why is that such an important frame that people enter?
I think it allows us, enables us, gives us permission or the responsibility to show up as imperfect, fallible, vulnerable human beings, and expects that we treat the people around us the same as well. I think, let's call a spade. As a species, we're living outside of our natural habitat. If you go back to the origins of our species, we lived in groups, 100 to 150 people. If we saw a neighboring group, we'd be threatened by that group. If we grew beyond 150, we would split into two different groups. We're not designed to live, we both live in a city with like 7 million people. There's no way that you and I will ever meet, interact with, be able in our biology to have the capacity to form relationship with 7 million people. And so, you and I have never met live. This is our first time, but we have these things called networks and LinkedIn profiles, and we take a look at those, and we've had some correspondence over email. And it's like, I get the sense that we care about similar things. Like, though we've never met, though we have different backgrounds, we actually can be part of the same community based upon our psychographics, our values, and our beliefs. But as humans, we aren't designed to care for thousands, if not millions of people. Indeed, any mayor or senior leader who says, I care about all 7 million citizens of this city, or I care about all 20,000 employees who work here, that's a biological lie. You just can't do it. And so the only way to scale leadership, team, trust, culture is one leader and one team at a time. The number of senior leadership teams that I've worked with that are high performing and high trust, many. I've also worked with many that aren't high performing and high trust, but the greatest ones know that they work on their gelling, their performance, and their health as a leadership team for the sole purpose of passing it on to their teams, and so on and so forth. And so I make the point that they're human because it's very easy for us to talk about managing people, managing performance, driving, doing all of these inhumane things to human beings. It's, I think, a real challenge in our organizations. And so I make the point so that we treat people as the human beings that they are.
Yeah. So let's pretend that I'm an old school guy who believes you come to work to do what I tell you to do, and you perform. I'm building a machine, and I want you to come here and do your job. Stop your complaining. I don't care about your feelings.
Mm-hmm.
What's the message that you might, knowing that I would not be receptive to your feedback? Well, let's pretend I'm very open to your feedback.
Yeah.
As this made up person, what's the message that you want to give to that person?
First and foremost, I would facetiously say, I think AI will be a great thing for you. Yeah, because it sounds like you want robots, and we're getting closer and closer. That's just going to be a very lonely, potentially lacking some creativity and innovation, because what AI is really good at doing is repeating what it knows. But when it comes to territory unknown, not as good. I would then say, do you care about your results? And they would say, well, of course, yes. And I say, well, if you care about your results, then you ought to care about your culture and the way that your people feel and show up to work, because the way that they feel and show up to work has an influence on how they perform. And even further, if you care about your results, I would say to this old-fashioned senior leader that the more senior one gets in an organization, the further away they typically get from the end user or customer, and the further away they typically get from the truth. Because we're still a hierarchical species, and the more senior you are, the more biologically we're wired to offer that person deference. And so I would say to that person, it is in your best interest for the results of your firm, the results of your organization, to hear from the perspectives, the voice, the opinions, the feelings of people who are closer to the opportunities and closer to the problems, if you indeed want to offer value to your end users.
And again, you and I come from similar frameworks, so I can't even disagree with anything you're saying there.
And it's hard work, and it sucks, you know, because leadership is hard, parenting is hard, caring about other people's emotions. Of course, it takes longer, but it allows you to move quicker and better. Yeah, in tension in the storm.
I think it takes longer in the short term. It's faster in the long term. Is how I often frame that, explain that. So now you've written a book which is on a topic that I would argue became very popular when Google published their research around the 5 indicators of high-performing teams, and they came up with psychological safety as number one.
Yes, and this is Project Aristotle that you're referring to.
Exactly. Why write a book on speak-up culture and the importance of it within the workplace and it driving results and performance and teams, etc.?
A few reasons. One, I saw a lot of senior leaders talking about psychological safety, but not actually practicing it. And so I felt that more work could be done to make it practical, accessible, and more real, and such that it's not just something that we provide lip service to, but actually do. Friends of mine, Minette Norman and Caroline Helbig, also wrote a great book on this called The Psychological Safety Playbook, which is fantastic. 25 moves to actually do it. And it sounds like you might be familiar with that. Yeah.
So for folks who are listening to this podcast, I have an episode interviewing them coming up soon. So look out for that one and follow me for more. Go ahead.
Bravo. I look forward to listening to that one. They're fantastic. So a couple things. I mean, one, while I'm a huge fan of Amy C. Edmondson, both her work and her as a person, she's wonderful. She actually endorsed my book, which is fantastic. And I like to call her sort of one of the founding mothers of psychological safety. She very much put it on the map. My contention with the body of work up until this point is, first and foremost, I don't love the name. Psychological safety, it's a mouthful, and it feels like we put an academic white lab coat on top of a very real and human topic full of feeling and emotion. I felt that it would be good to have an engaging case, story-based, backed in research, but a more less academic and more for your everyday manager book to bring these concepts to life. Now, what's interesting is as I wrote the book, I simply thought I was rebranding psychological safety. As I wrote the book, I did a good old Zig Ziglar, people don't buy drills, they buy holes. Well, if psychological safety is the drill, what you get as a result, the hole, is a speak-up culture. But as I delved into the work, delved into the research, and had an amazing team help me with this, I realized that we ask ourselves two questions before we make the choice to speak up. One, is it psychologically safe to speak up? And two, is it worth it? Is it worth the risk? It never goes without fear in speaking up. There's always fear. And so I created this framework, which is the thesis of my book, of is it safe and is it worth it? If it's both a perception that it's safe and worth it, we're more likely to speak up. Of course, you and I could report into the same leader. I could say that they're the best leader I've ever had. And you could say, do we work for the same leader? I think they're awful. And we're both right because it's perception. But as you look at it, if it isn't safe and it isn't worth it, you have an unhappy marriage between fear and apathy, not likely to have a speak-up culture. This is where you get quiet quitting and resignation. And indeed, if you speak up, you typically just get in trouble and it's just worse on you. But there's two other quadrants. One is high safety, low impact. The other is low safety, high impact. If it's high safety but low impact, we might feel safe speaking up, but it doesn't really feel like it'll be fruitful, right? Either due to bureaucracy, red tape, systemic issues that are simply too hard to overcome in this moment, or changes in habits that are simply hard. I could have a very dear friend who I feel very safe with, who has unhealthy eating habits or drinking habits or whatever it might be, and I might feel safe to form an intervention and speak up, but do I feel that it's going to lead to any meaningful change? Unlikely. And I'll probably stop speaking up over time after repeated attempts because I'm ignored and it's not making an impact and it's not worth it. It might even damage our relationship and slip into it not being a safe relationship. But the most interesting quadrant for me, which proves to me that you actually don't need psychological safety for people to make the choice to speak up. It's not an optimal, healthy culture. But when you don't have safety, but the stakes are too high, this is often where you get whistleblowing or hopefully first courageous leadership. You have folks like Ed Pearson, who's a senior manager at Boeing, who was making the 737 MAX, who to his own risk, to his reputation, relationships, job, spoke up saying that this is not a safe plane. This is also Kimberly Young McClear, who's a queer Black doctor in the U.S. Coast Guard, who spoke up about harassment issues and whistleblew on harassment issues. Takes huge amounts of courage, but it still points to me that you don't necessarily need psychological safety for people to speak up, which I think is pretty interesting. So that's why I wrote it.
I have another question that I think, again, might be a little bit unfair, but what's the whole of, what's the two things? Is it worth it? And is it
safe
and
is it worth it?
Is it worth it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the whole for is it safe and is it worth it? Why am I spending time on making it safe and making it worth it? What's the whole for that?
Well, there's a benefit both to the health and well-being and morale of your people, as well as the data and information you're receiving from a diverse point of view that allows you to make better business decisions. So, I mean, the business case for a speak-up culture is people who are closest to problems and closest to opportunities feel that it is safe and worth it, that it is encouraged and rewarded to speak up, which allows you to avoid disaster, make better decisions, have a better running organization. There's a business case for this. That when people who are closest to the problems and opportunities feel empowered, safe, that it's worth it to speak up, you typically have a more robust, healthier, vibrant, sustainable organization.
So it ends up being a performance thing for people if it's safe and if it's worth it. Is that fit?
It's both better for your culture and better for your performance long term. Absolutely.
Maybe, I read your book, loved the book. Maybe what I think we need is maybe just walk us through an example, or because you reference a couple there, but just walk us through an example of how somebody went about making their organization both safe and worth it to speak up, and the benefits that they receive from that. Sure.
I'll first do a quick example of when it didn't work and then one where it did work. If you'll allow it.
Perfect. So
one example of it not working, there was an MBA student in one of Scott Sonnenshine's courses at Rice University, and they were speaking about psychological safety. And one of his students raised his hand and said, my last job before coming to take my MBA here was on an oil rig. And I feel compelled to share this example because it's a quintessential example of how to ruin psychological safety in a speak-up culture. There was an incident on board this rig where by mistake, someone installed something incorrectly. There was damage. And the captain of the ship called an all-hands meeting, pointed out the issue, and said, who's responsible? We need to learn from this so it doesn't happen again. And the person who was responsible for it very quickly came forward and said, it was me. And the captain said, thank you, you're fired, which is a perfect way to obliterate a speak-up culture. You said, we need to figure out who's responsible so we can learn from this. Well, you just fired the very person who you can help you learn from it. You could say, we need to see who's responsible so we can take corrective action. That's a better warning. But further, the next time a mistake happens on board, which by the way, we're human, it happens. Do you think people are going to rush forward to take responsibility or spend more time and energy hiding that mistake from others? So that's an example of how to squash it. A quintessential example of a speak-up culture learning is a well-documented story of Alan Mullally, when Alan Mullally went from Boeing Commercial, and he's credited to helping to keep Boeing Commercial on the map with its competitor Airbus. He moved over to Ford in 2004. In the press conference to join Ford, he was asked what car he drove, and he said a Lexus, because it's the best car on the road. It was a rallying cry to his company to make a product that he would want to actually drive. And so the previous leader at Ford, before Mullally took over, had a reputation of being more tyrannic. And it would, if you went to your weekly status report meetings with that senior leader, if you brought any bad news, you were made to be the problem. And it was as if you were sitting at a boardroom table with Dr. Evil, right? If you brought bad news, a red button would be pushed, and you just wouldn't be at the next meeting, right? And what's the conditioning of the leadership team there? Only share good news. Don't be the problem. Don't raise your hand and say that there's an issue here. And so as Mullally took over, he did what most of us would do. He would have weekly status meetings with his direct reports, ask for a standard green, yellow, red. And for the first number of weeks, everything was green. And he went, team, I'm really frustrated because I'm not sure if you've looked at our financial statements. We're not performing well. And so if you're reporting to me that everything is hunky-dory and green, either your people are lying to you or you're lying to me. We need to embrace more truth-telling in this organization if we actually want to turn this thing around and save this company from bankruptcy. And as he sort of made that spiel and made that speech, one individual, Mark Fields, raised his hand and said, I have an issue that I need some help with here. And when Mark had that courage and vulnerability to share an issue, Mullally apparently stood up, gave him a standing ovation, and said, we need more of that, Mark. Thank you. Who can help Mark? Someone else raised their hand, and a new precedent had been set. At the next weekly team meeting, Mark was actually informally promoted and sat next to Mullally at the table to insinuate more of that. And Mark became the successor to Mullally as the next CEO of Ford. And Ford was the only major manufacturing company that did not require a government bailout in 2008, 2009. So that, to me, is like the quintessential perfect example of embrace more truth-telling. This isn't about sharing good news all the time. That's not possible. And don't punish people and make them the problem. Reward the behavior of them speaking up and get them more support. So to me, that's a great example of what not to do. It's in the oil rig example, as well as a better example of, I think, what to do in the case of Mullally at Ford.
Amazing. Yeah, another great example. So let's get into the crux. We're half an hour in, and I'm now saying, hey, let's get into the crux of this podcast.
Hopefully you're still listening, listener.
Yeah. So two questions I'm interested in exploring, at least this season and in this iteration of the podcast, is how do people become better people in business? Do you have any thoughts or ideas around how to become better people in business?
That's so good. I mean, I think the answer to the question of how to become better people in business is just how to become better people. And the wonderful thing about that is that work is never done. We'll always work on becoming better people. Now, my version, or when I hear better people, I think better leaders. I think leadership is not a title. Leadership is in our behavior. And so then I go to what are the behaviors that make someone a great leader, regardless of if they were hired in a junior role last week or are a CEO. And to me, those behaviors are around empathy and compassion, service orientation, showing up to serve, not simply to take, being authentic and consistent, even being decisive, and especially being accountable and responsible, taking responsibility for when things don't go well and giving credit when things do go well. So, and patience, I used to think I was a patient person until I had kids. Turns out not so patient. Who knew? I've been tested. So I think the greatest people in business are the people who have a growth mindset, are always willing and wanting to learn, and show up with greater empathy, compassion, patience, curiosity for the other human beings around them, more space, acceptance, and tolerance and invitation. it's not about agreeing, you know. I think one of the myths about a speak up culture and psychological safety is that we agree all the time and everyone's nice to each other and no one gets, offended and there's no tension. And that's just not true. The sign of a speak up culture and psychological safety is that we disagree well, that you and I can hold, you know, there's a lot that we agree upon, but I'm sure there are things that we disagree upon or we have different perspectives or experiences on. And the sign of a speak up culture is one where we can hold that tension with curiosity and get through to the other end better, still maybe without agreeing, which is beautiful. And we need that more in society.
I want to take a minute and just plug Leanne Davey. She has an amazing book on exactly that.
Yes. The Good Fight.
Yeah, The Good Fight is, and she also introduced me to you, put you on my radar as well. So I just want to plug her because her notion is basically we need more fighting. More conflict. We need to have more and better conflict, and which is why I lean into how do we have better conversations in business, etc.
Yes. Yeah. And when there is conflict, you can rub your hands together and go, ooh, juicy. Like, you know, so long as there's trust and respect here, this is actually an opportunity to tighten our relationship and grow. You know, when I've been part of trusting teams, conflict is actually like, all right, like as Brene Brown says, let's rumble, like let's get in here and figure it out and come out the other end better. And I love that Leanne calls it conflict debt, that the more you delay conflict, the worse it gets. And then all of a sudden you have an outrageous reaction. You know, when the feelings outweigh the facts, you know that there's some conflict debt going on.
Yeah. I also want to double click on a couple of things you said prior to that. So you talked about how you vision people be better people. What are some of the things or practices or habits or, approaches people can take so that they can step into the leadership as you described it there? Do you have any ideas around that?
Well, I think, Keita, there's no mistake that every single leadership development program that I've ever heard of, participated in, or facilitated in all starts with a module on self, right? There's always a piece of leader as self or self-awareness, right? And the work of learning about oneself is never done, as I've said. You know, you can still be learning about yourself on your deathbed, which is kind of one of the marvels of being a human being. So I think so much of the work of doing this is figuring out what are your strengths. Like, we all have strengths. There's something that we all have superhuman magic power around. And the irony is oftentimes we're blind to it or we don't see it ourselves. I'll give you an example of this. One of my superhuman magic tricks is communication. I love finding words to express feelings and ideas in a compelling way. I love doing it. I'm good at it, right? I will be in the car, be on a walk, or even be in the shower, and I'm thinking of how to draft an email or write a social media thing, right? Now, my only truth is my perception. When I do that, I think everyone must do that. But apparently people don't. Like, I'm still kind of floored, you know, and I've shared this with a number of people. You're shaking your head, right? It's like, I don't do that. And I'm like, really? Like, what do you do? You know? But we all have these different strengths that set us into flow. I'll pause. I feel like you want to throw something in here as well.
No. I do that. So I was agreeing with you that, but most people don't do that.
Most people don't. Right.
Where I fall short is that because I come from academia, I use language that alienates people. So the muscle that I need to build is, imagine I'm speaking to my 4-year-old son and try and use language that he can understand. And that's not patronizing to anybody. It's just, instead of...
It's the lens. That's your lens.
Breaking it down. How do I break this down and not use highfalutin? When I was in academia, I swear to God, the whole purpose of those articles was sometimes to confuse people. Sometimes. That was the whole purpose. It was like, how can you read confusing writing? Okay, here's your PhD. Now, I'm being very facetious, but sorry.
Yeah, just give me the abstract, please.
Yeah.
I think, the question of how to develop oneself as a leader or a human being, first is self-awareness around what are your strengths, what are your limitations, how can you amplify your strengths, and how can you solve for your limitations, whether that's through upskilling or training, delegation, vulnerability with your team, better teaming. And then it's how can you deliberately put yourself into experiences and circumstances and situations where you can grow those muscles of amplifying strengths, as well as mitigating for limitations, as well as how, I like to think that I'm a pretty tolerant, accepting human being, that I create the space for as many people as possible to stand out, fit in, add. But just like you, I have biases. I'm not perfect, but I do care about gender equality and racial justice, and LGBTQ2S plus rights. Like, I care about these things, but there are still things and people that I don't know and people I don't have meaningful relationship with. So if I truly care about this stuff, I must put myself in situations where I'm challenged, where I'm developing relationship with, quote, my other or the other, and like so much hatred in our human experience is because people haven't spent time with the other, there's a beautiful documentary on this and a powerful documentary on this by a Muslim woman, Dia Khan, who wants to study the very people who hate her. And she happens to go and meet a group of white nationalists as they are getting ready for Charlottesville in, I guess it was July 2000, was it 16 or 17? I could be getting that wrong and I feel awful about that. But she goes and meets these people and ends up developing friendships with some very senior leaders in the White Nationalist Party who end up leaving the party because their very identity is shook. Yeah. They developed a better relationship with the very person they were supposed to hate than with people that they would previously call a brother or sister. So many people who hate others have no relationship with the other. And so I commit myself to develop as many relationships as I can with the other so I can actually grow as a human being and live into who I claim I want to be.
I'm going to say two things on that. I really struggle to live my politics publicly because I'm afraid of what clients think, what people think, especially as a Black male and in the space that I'm in as an author, etc. I fully admit I struggle with that. I'm definitely more left-leaning than right-leaning. I am on that side. So with another podcast guest, the conversation we had was, your book is about speak-up culture in organizations. There's a problem with speak-up culture in society.
Yep.
Where people are afraid to have meaningful conversations publicly, like somebody like myself, who I might think about sharing an article on LinkedIn and I'm like, I'm not sharing this because it's not safe and it's not worth it.
Yep.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Because, okay, you and I both work in organizations, we consult in those organizations, but if we live in a world that's not producing what your book is about, a speak-up culture, I question, what are we doing? I didn't plan to ask you this question. I noticed that that's a really tough one. So
yeah.
And
I don't have all the answers there. I have a few ideas. Exactly. I don't have all the answers for sure. Yeah. And I do want to correct the awful rally in Charlottesville happened August 11th, 2017.
Oh, and before you answer the question, the second thing I was going to say was, I think his name is Daryl Davis. He's a musician who did a similar thing. So he was a musician, Black musician, who went and got to know KKK members, and there's a documentary on him. You should look him up. He's phenomenal as well. So
thank you. I will. That's great. Cool. Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about that speak-up culture in public or in society, and what How do we address that? I don't know what to do there.
So I write about a couple cases where I think it was Basecamp. There was one tech company, Basecamp that said there will be no more political conversation at the company and on our Slack channels or whatever. And they essentially said if it doesn't have to do about work, you can't talk about it here. And 40% of their employee base resigned. And so that's, from my perspective, I don't think the solution is just putting a muzzle on people. And to pretend that what happens outside of work doesn't impact how people show up at their jobs is foolish. So for me, I think we need to create more space, especially for our marginalized populations as it relates to anti-Asian hate and relates to racism. When with the murder of George Floyd, to pretend that people aren't struggling or concerned or showing up to work in fear, I think we need to create more space, not less space. As a Jewish person, I like to say I put the ish in Jew, but I'm still Jewish. When there's an attack on a synagogue, that has an impact on showing up. For a parent, when there's another frickin' school shooting, even if it's in a country that's south of me, that impacts how I show up, especially when I go to that country quite a bit for work. And so, it's not about, I think the way to make progress here is leadership. And it's not about right or wrong, left or right. It's about embracing the humanity and embracing the gray here. So I'll give you an example of another documentary that I think can give some help here, which is done by my friend Juliana Tafur. She has a documentary called Listen and programs called Listen Courageously, and I write about this in the book as well. So what she decided to do, she's a first-generation Colombian immigrant. Her parents moved to this country without knowing English, or pardon me, this country meaning the U.S. And so she has spent a career and a life, wanting to fit in and wanting to belong. So she ends up making this documentary where she gets two people who are on complete polar opposites on major U.S. hot topic pressing issues: gun reform, abortion, and immigration rights. And she got people who were on opposing views on each of those three. She asked them if they would come together for a facilitated conversation, and they all said yes. Now, the reason they all said yes is they thought that they would just have a stage to convince others why their viewpoint was right. But it wasn't about right or wrong. It was about connection. And she had them meet, have conversation. In some instances, they created art to essentially express their story. And out of two of the three conversations, the conversations on gun rights as well as the conversation on abortion rights, those two conversations ended with people in tears, hugging each other and not changing their view, but understanding why the other person was rightful in holding their view, even though it didn't change their own. Ironically, the conversation that didn't work out was the immigration rights conversation. There was a second generation immigrant speaking with a first generation immigrant, and the first generation immigrant who in their lifetime immigrated to the US accused the second generation immigrant of being anti-American for having reform viewpoints on immigration, which is just ironic. And that conversation ended abruptly, and it didn't go anywhere. So my very attempted bottom line answer to this, as I've gone on for a few minutes here, is I think we need more leadership, more safe space to disagree, to hear why one another holds a point of view, and to try to make more people right, not wrong, without having to change your view. To just strive to understand. One of my best friends and closest colleagues is completely different from me. Different gender, different religion, different political affiliation. We're around the same age. And I love her. She's wonderful. She's a wonderful human being. And though we don't agree on everything, there's enough trust and safety that we can have a conversation where I can understand why she holds the views that she holds, and she understands why I hold the views that I hold. We don't yuck each other's yum, and we just go on. But I know she's a wonderful human being that cares about me, and that's all that matters. So we need more of that, and more safe spaces for leaders to help facilitate that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. I know that was a difficult question, but I just feel like it's one that we are pushing under the rug, and the rug is getting lumpy.
Yeah.
So I feel like we do need to have that conversation. So
thank you.
Thank you for taking a very good stab at that.
Thanks. I hope it helps.
Oh yeah. So I think as we kind of think about rounding off this conversation, the next question I want to talk about is, how do you think people become better business people? Do you have any ideas, thoughts around how do people become better business people?
So I think first and foremost, I think sometimes people are challenged with, leaders are challenged with, how do I be a good human and how do I be good at business? And I don't think these need to be competing, opposing forces. If you have someone on your team that is struggling or underperforming or isn't in the right role, or there's a market challenge and you're having a really hard time, keeping everyone employed, there are still humane ways that you can go about those hard, challenging times. I think any organization that their first line of defense is mass layoffs is a very weak organization. And there isn't a single study that has proven that mass layoffs work. They just don't. They're awful for culture, and you let go of a ton of people who have a lot of institutional knowledge. I think there are more creative ways that you can go about that if you're in that hard position, inclusive of asking your people for some creative ideas. There's one case study of an organization called Barry Wehmiller of St. Louis that in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, instead of laying off employees, they asked all employees to take 3-week unpaid vacation. And the way it was announced from their CEO, Bob Chapman, was so important. He said, it's important that we should all suffer a little bit than any one of us should suffer a lot. Now, there are many leaders who were in the financial position where they could take 3 weeks off, right? And there were others who couldn't. And what happened without instruction is people who could afford it more would go to people who could afford it less and say, give me some of your weeks. You work, get paid, I won't. That wasn't a corporate mandate. That wasn't, and corporate didn't say, hey, you're not allowed to do that. They made it okay. And so I do think that we can still show up with our humanity when business is tough, and that we can still show up with compassion and empathy. And if you have someone on your team who's struggling, what are your goals? What do you need? Maybe they're in the wrong role. How can you support them to thrive, whether it's at your organization or a different one? So those are a few thoughts.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Is there something that if people just understood this thing, it would make your job a little bit easier?
So two things come to mind. One is, this is actually a quote from comedian Craig Ferguson. Stumbled across, I think, one of the most brilliant Venn diagrams when it comes to a speak up culture, which is, does this need to be said? Does it need to be said now? And does it need to be said by me? And I just think it provides discernment, because a speak up culture isn't sharing all the things all the time with all the people. That can be chaos, that can be disruptive, that can be emotionally unintelligent or situationally unaware. So I think those three questions, does it need to be said? Yes or no? Does it need to be said now? Yes or no? Does it need to be said by me? A really interesting one is, it needs to be said right now, but not by me. That's an interesting one, where it's like, hey, Keita, can you say the thing that I think will help move this conversation ahead? That's a really interesting one. And if you do have a speak up culture, it's welcome. So that's one. The other is, we talked about make it safe, make it worth it. I just want to double click on, I mentioned it a little bit, but if you really want to create a speak up culture, the two actions in any relationship, whether you're a leader in a friendship is encourage people to share their truth and reward them when they do, especially if the message is hard to hear. Reward the behavior, not necessarily the message. So encourage and reward is the key in how to create a speak up culture.
Yeah. And final question before we close off. Do you have a favorite quote?
Ooh, my favorite quote right now is from my dear friend Rich Davini, who wrote the book The Attributes, and he's a retired U.S. SEAL. And he says, he understands leadership and its value more than most. His quote on leadership is, "Leaders aren't born, leaders aren't even made. Leaders are chosen based upon the way that they behave."
I love that.
Love that one.
All right. Before we close off, is there something you'd like to tell our listeners and share with them as we finish our conversation and not necessarily complete it?
Yes, finish it. I hope that you're still listening. I hope that this was both engaging and useful, and I appreciate the any patience, empathy, and curiosity extended my way as we navigated some questions and topics and conversations that are challenging, that are imperfect, and that I know I'm still trying to figure out how to show up as my best and keep learning and growing. So I hope this was valuable, and I hope to connect again soon with you, Keita, and your audience as well. It was a joy to do so.
Awesome. Thank you, listeners, for joining me yet another time when I'm interviewing someone who can help us mumble or fumble our way through those two interesting questions. How do we become better people in business, and how do we become better business people? See you next time when I'm interviewing yet another person who will share their views on those two questions. Thank you for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening to Conversations with Keita Demming. Over the years, I've learned that few things will impact or improve your life more than improving your strategies and having better conversations with the people you wish to serve. If you like today's guest and the idea is shared, please like, follow, and provide a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also visit my website to sign up for my newsletter and learn about the release of my upcoming book. I look forward to the next episode where we'll be in conversation with someone who will help you become a better business person and a better person in business. See you next time.